Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow to a gentle rhythm that asks nothing of you, but to simply continue, one breath after another, each exhalation carrying away whatever tension you have brought with you from the day. There is no need to hurry through this moment, no urgency that cannot wait until morning. The world outside will turn without your watchfulness, and you are permitted, for now, to withdraw from it completely. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, releasing the burden they've been carrying since you woke. Feel the weight of your arms becoming heavier, your hands settling into stillness wherever they have come to rest. Your jaw may unclench if it wishes. Your tongue may rest easy against the floor of your mouth, and the small muscles around your eyes may soften and release their constant vigilance. You are safe here, in this quiet space between waking and sleeping, where stories drift like slow smoke and nothing requires your immediate attention. The story that waits for you is not one of excitement or urgency, but of the most ordinary completion of the most ordinary day, and it will unfold at the pace of settling embers and cooling tea, asking nothing of you except that you allow yourself to be carried gently forward into rest. Breathe slowly, and as you do, begin to imagine a modest office in a city that belonged to another century, where gaslight flickers against dark paneling and the air holds the faint scent of coal smoke and old paper. You need not see it clearly yet, for you are drifting toward it gradually, and there is time enough to let the details emerge as your mind grows quieter and your body grows heavier, and the day releases its hold on you entirely. The room exists somewhere in London, in that vast accumulation of streets and buildings that constituted the commercial heart of the empire during the latter decades of Queen Victoria's reign, a period when the city had grown to proportions that would have astonished its earlier inhabitants, when gaslight had become commonplace, but electric illumination remained a novelty. When the railway had connected the metropolis to every corner of the realm, but the journey from one side of the city to the other might still consume the better part of an afternoon. Now, gently we may begin. The office stood at the end of a narrow corridor on the third floor of a building whose exterior had long ago settled into a comfortable anonymity among the soot-darkened facades of the surrounding commercial district. The building itself was unremarkable, one structure among thousands, erected in the 1850s during a period of expansion when whole streets of such buildings had been constructed to house the growing army of clerks and merchants and small commercial concerns that served the machinery of empire and trade. The door, made of heavy oak and fitted with a brass plate that bore only the words "Accounts" in simple engraved letters, opened into a single rectangular room whose dimensions spoke of an earlier architectural era when space was apportioned with a certain generous restraint that would not survive the pressures of the later decades. The room was perhaps 20 feet in length and 14 in width, with a ceiling that rose to a height of 12 feet, sufficient to accommodate the tall sash windows that occupied most of the wall facing the street. These windows, 2 in number and divided into 12 panes, each by narrow wooden muntins that had been painted white some years ago, and now showed the inevitable yellowing that such paint develops under the influence of time and London air, looked out onto a view of other windows across the way, belonging to buildings of similar vintage and similar purpose. Their own interiors occasionally visible as lamps were lit in the advancing dusk. The street below was not one of the great thoroughfares, but rather a secondary route that served primarily those whose business brought them to this particular district, and the traffic that passed along it was accordingly modest in volume, consisting mainly of commercial vehicles making deliveries and the occasional cab, conveying a visitor to one of the many offices that occupied the buildings on either side. It was now 6:30 on a Tuesday evening in late November, and the day that had been conducted within these walls had reached its natural conclusion. The ledgers had been balanced, the correspondence had been sorted and filed, the various small transactions that constitute the daily operation of a modest commercial concern had been duly recorded in their proper columns, and all that remained was the quiet ritual of putting the office to rest for the night. The clerk who performed this ritual, and who had indeed performed it with only minor variations for the past 7 years, was a man of middle age and unremarkable appearance whose name was Thomas Wickham. He stood now at his desk, which occupied the position nearest to the fire, methodically replacing the caps on the several inkwells that were arranged along the back edge of the desktop in a row that corresponded to the different qualities of ink required for different purposes. There were 3 inkwells in total, each made of heavy glass and fitted with a brass cap that screwed down to create a seal against evaporation. The largest of these contained black ink of the standard commercial variety, used for the majority of entries in the ledgers and for all ordinary correspondence. The second contained red ink, employed for marking totals and for drawing the lines that separated one section of accounts from another. The third, smallest of the 3, contained a special blue-black ink that Mr. Wickham reserved for entries that required particular emphasis or permanence, those notations that might need to be consulted years hence, and which therefore demanded an ink less susceptible to fading than the ordinary black variety. The desk itself was a substantial piece of furniture constructed from dark oak that had been seasoned to a depth of color that suggested great age, though in truth it had been manufactured less than 40 years earlier by a firm that specialized in furnishings for professional offices. It featured a slanted writing surface that could be raised or lowered by means of a brass mechanism on either side, though in practice Mr. Wickham kept it at a fixed angle that he had determined long ago to be optimal for the work of recording figures in the large bound ledgers that were the primary instruments of his daily labor. The angle he preferred was approximately 15 degrees from horizontal, steep enough to allow the hand to move freely across the page without requiring an awkward elevation of the elbow, yet not so steep that items placed upon the surface would be in danger of sliding off. This angle had been arrived at through years of experience and represented one of those small adjustments that a man makes to his working environment over time, unconsciously refining the conditions of his labor to minimize strain and maximize efficiency, though Mr. Wickham himself would not have described it in such terms, being conscious only of the fact that this particular angle felt correct and that any significant deviation from it introduced a vague discomfort that interfered with his concentration. The surface of the desk, though well-maintained and regularly cleaned, bore the accumulated marks of long use. There were small indentations where pens had been pressed too firmly against the wood, faint stains where ink had escaped from carelessly handled bottles, a slight depression near the front edge where Mr. Wickham's left arm habitually rested while his right hand moved across the pages of the ledger. These imperfections did not detract from the functionality of the piece, but rather added to it a certain character, a visible record of the countless hours of labor that had been performed upon its surface. Along the back edge of the desk, in addition to the inkwells, there were arranged several other items essential to the work of accounting. A wooden pen tray held 6 pens of varying sizes, each fitted with a steel nib that had been selected for a particular type of work. The finest nibs were used for entering figures in the narrow columns of the cash book, where precision was paramount and the slightest variation in the size of numerals could lead to confusion in later consultations. The broader nibs were employed for correspondence and for those entries in the ledger where the text consisted of names or descriptions rather than figures. Beside the pen tray stood a small ceramic vessel containing a collection of pencils in various states of wear. These were used primarily for preliminary calculations that would later be transferred to the permanent record in ink, or for making notations on loose papers that did not require the formality of ink. Mr. Wickham maintained a strict distinction between the use of pencil and the use of ink, the former being appropriate only for temporary or draft work, the latter for all entries that would become part of the official record. This distinction was not merely a personal preference, but reflected the broader practice of accounting in that era, when the permanence of ink represented a kind of commitment to the accuracy of the entry being made. A small knife with a bone handle served the dual purpose of sharpening pencils and trimming the occasional rough edge from a sheet of paper. Next to it lay a ruler of boxwood, 12 inches in length and marked with fine gradations, used for drawing the lines that structured the pages of the ledgers and for measuring the precise margins that Mr. Wickham maintained in all his work. There was also a small rectangular block of India rubber, somewhat worn at the corners from use, which could remove pencil marks but was useless against ink, a limitation that reinforced the need for care in making permanent entries. The ledgers themselves, 7 in number, sat now in a neat stack at the left side of the desk, their leather spines showing the wear of frequent handling. Each bore a label affixed to its cover indicating the year and category of accounts it contained, and together they represented a complete record of the financial transactions of Messrs. Thornberry and Associates, a small firm engaged in the importation of textile goods from various European manufacturers for distribution to retailers in the southern counties. The largest of these ledgers, bound in Morocco leather that had faded from its original deep burgundy to a duller shade of brown, contained the general accounts that tracked the overall financial position of the firm. Its pages were organized according to the double-entry system that had been standard practice in English commerce for centuries. Each transaction recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, so that the books would balance and any error in recording would reveal itself through the failure of the two sides to match. Mr. Wickham opened this ledger now, not to make any new entry, but simply to review the final totals that he had calculated earlier in the afternoon, confirming once more that all was in order before the office was closed for the night. The figures marched down the page in neat columns, each numeral formed with the careful precision that had been drilled into Mr. Wickham during his years of training as a clerk. The handwriting was neither ornate nor plain, but occupied a middle ground of clarity and efficiency, each number distinct and unambiguous. The loops of the eights fully closed, the ones distinguished by a small upward flourish at the top that prevented them from being mistaken for sevens. This style of numerical notation was so consistent throughout the ledger that the pages appeared almost as if they had been printed rather than written by hand, a testament to the discipline that Mr. Wickham brought to his work. He ran his finger down the final column, checking each total against the mental calculation he had performed earlier, and found no discrepancy. The day's accounts were balanced. The sum of debits equaled the sum of credits. The financial position of Messrs. Thornberry and Associates was accurately recorded and ready to be carried forward to the next day's transactions. Mr. Wickham closed the ledger with a sense of quiet satisfaction, the feeling that comes from work completed according to proper standards, neither rushed nor prolonged beyond necessity, but simply done as it ought to be done. Mr. Wickham had been in the employ of Messrs. Thornberry and Associates for the entirety of his tenure in this office, having come to them at the age of 32, following a period of what might be termed unsettled circumstances in his earlier career. Prior to joining this firm, he had held positions with several other commercial concerns, none of which had proven entirely satisfactory for reasons that varied from one situation to the next. In one instance, the firm had failed due to the imprudence of its principal. In another, Mr. Wickham had found himself unable to work harmoniously with a senior clerk whose methods differed significantly from his own. In a third case, the nature of the business had proven incompatible with certain of Mr. Wickham's principles regarding the conduct of commercial affairs. But here, at Messrs. Thornberry and Associates, he had found a situation that suited his temperament and his capabilities. The work was steady but not excessive. The expectations were clear and reasonable. The compensation was modest but reliable. And the Messrs. Thornberry, both father and son, were men of regular habits and sound business judgment who conducted their affairs with a probity that Mr. Wickham could respect. In the 7 years of his employment, he had never been asked to make an entry that struck him as questionable, never been required to conceal information that ought properly to be disclosed, never been placed in a position where his duties conflicted with his sense of what was correct. This alignment of circumstance and character had allowed Mr. Wickham to settle into his work with a completeness that he had not experienced in his previous positions. He knew the accounts of the firm as thoroughly as a man might know the rooms of his own house, understanding not merely the individual transactions, but the larger patterns of trade and payment that gave those transactions their meaning. He could predict with reasonable accuracy when certain payments would arrive, when certain expenses would need to be dispersed, when the cash reserves of the firm would be at their strongest, and when they would be most strained. This knowledge was not the result of any particular genius, but simply the accumulation of close attention applied consistently over an extended period. The room in which Mr. Wickham performed his duties was heated by a small coal fire that burned in a grate set into the wall opposite the windows, a narrow cast-iron fitting of the type that had become standard in commercial buildings during the previous 2 decades. The grate was perhaps 18 inches wide and 20 inches high, designed to burn coal rather than wood, with a series of horizontal bars that allowed air to circulate beneath the fuel and with a small ash pan that could be removed for cleaning. The fire at this hour had been allowed to burn down considerably from the height it had reached in the afternoon, when Mr. Wickham had added fresh coal at approximately 3 o'clock to ensure that the office would remain comfortably warm through the remainder of the working day. Now, 3.5 hours later, the fire consisted primarily of a bed of glowing coals that gave off a steady warmth sufficient to keep the chill of the evening from penetrating too deeply into the room, though the corners farthest from the hearth remained noticeably cooler, and Mr. Wickham kept a woolen shawl draped over the back of his chair for those moments when he found himself standing near the window or the door. The coals glowed with that particular deep red that indicates a coal fire in its later stages, when the initial flames have subsided and the fuel has been reduced to its essential carbon, burning now with a concentrated heat that requires no additional feeding, but which will eventually exhaust itself as the carbon is consumed. The light from these coals was sufficient to cast a faint ruddy glow on the immediate surroundings of the fireplace, illuminating the cast iron surround and the small brass implements that hung in a stand beside the grate. These implements consisted of a poker, a small shovel for removing ash, and a pair of tongs for arranging coals or adding fresh fuel to the fire. Each was made of iron with a brass handle, the metal darkened by heat and use, but still functional and properly maintained. Mr. Wickham kept these tools clean and in good repair, for he had a general principle that objects deserved to be cared for if they were to provide reliable service, and he applied this principle to the fire irons as he did to his pens and ledgers and all the other instruments of his daily work. The mantelpiece above the fire was of black marble, a modest piece perhaps 4 feet in width, its surface unadorned except for a clock that occupied the center position. This clock was of German manufacture, housed in a wooden case of dark walnut with a glass face that protected the hands and numerals. It was wound once each week by Mr. Wickham on Monday mornings, this being one of his regular duties, and it kept time with a reasonable degree of accuracy, rarely varying by more than a minute or two from the correct hour, as determined by the clock tower of the parish church that stood 3 streets away. The clock's mechanism made a steady ticking sound that was just audible in the quiet of the office, a gentle rhythmic pulse that marked the passage of seconds and minutes with mechanical regularity. Mr. Wickham had grown so accustomed to this sound that he rarely noticed it consciously, but on those occasions when the clock stopped, usually because he had forgotten to wind it, the silence that resulted was oddly conspicuous, as though some essential element of the office's character had been removed. The walls of the room were paneled in wood to a height of approximately 6 feet. The panels constructed of pine that had been stained a dark brown and finished with several coats of varnish that had yellowed with age. Above this paneling, the walls were covered with a paper of muted green featuring a small repeating pattern of leaves and vines, a design that had been fashionable at the time of the building's construction, but which now appeared somewhat dated, though not unpleasantly so. The ceiling was plastered and painted white, though the paint had acquired a faintly yellowish tinge from years of exposure to the smoke from gas lamps and the coal fire. The floor was of oak boards, wide planks that had been laid when the building was constructed and which showed the wear of decades of foot traffic in the variation of their color and in the slight depression of a path from the door to the desk and from the desk to the fireplace. These boards were covered in the central portion of the room by a carpet of dark red wool, somewhat worn but still serviceable, which helped to reduce the chill that would otherwise rise from the floor during the winter months. Mr. Wickham moved now from the desk to the fireplace, where he took up the poker from its stand and stirred the coals gently, not with any intention of reviving the fire to greater intensity, but simply to redistribute the remaining fuel so that it would burn more evenly and provide warmth for another hour at least. The poker, an iron rod perhaps 2 feet in length with a curved end designed for hooking and moving coals, was heavier than one might expect, its weight concentrated in the business and to provide leverage when manipulating the burning fuel. As he stirred the coals, a small shower of sparks rose briefly before settling back into the general glow, and the increased air circulation caused a momentary brightening of the fire. the coals responding to the oxygen with a renewed intensity that would last only a few minutes before subsiding again. Mr. Wickham watched this small drama without any particular emotional engagement, simply observing the predictable behavior of burning material in the presence of air, a phenomenon he had witnessed countless times before and which held no particular interest beyond its utilitarian function of providing heat. He replaced the poker in its stand with care, ensuring that it did not strike against the iron surround and create any unnecessary noise. The silence of the office at this hour was something that Mr. Wickham had come to appreciate during his years of employment here, and he was instinctively reluctant to disturb it with any avoidable sound. During the working day, the room was occupied not only by himself, but by Mr. Thornberry, Jr., whose desk stood against the wall beneath the windows, positioned to take advantage of the natural light that entered the room during the daytime hours. Mr. Thornberry, Jr. was a man of perhaps 35 years, the eldest son of the firm's founder, and he had been groomed from youth to eventually assume control of the business. He was methodical in his work habits, punctual in his attendance, and courteous in his dealings with Mr. Wickham, maintaining the sort of professional relationship that allowed the two men to work together efficiently without the necessity of developing any personal friendship. Occasionally, the office was also occupied by Mr. Thornberry Sr., the founder of the firm, who maintained a separate office on the floor below, but who would sometimes ascend the stairs to consult with his son or to review certain accounts that required his personal attention. These visits were never prolonged for the elder Mr. Thornberry was now in his 68th year and found the stairs increasingly difficult, but his continued involvement in the firm's affairs provided a certain continuity and stability that both his son and Mr. Wickham valued. The presence of these other individuals necessarily introduced a degree of sound into the environment, whether from conversation regarding business matters or from the movement of furniture as chairs were adjusted or desk drawers were opened and closed, or from the simple fact of additional footsteps crossing the floor and additional pages being turned in ledgers and correspondence being sorted and filed. But now, with the working day concluded and his colleagues departed to their respective homes, Mr. Wickham found himself alone in a quietude that felt less like emptiness than like a kind of completion, as though the office itself required this period of solitude to settle back into its proper form after the various disturbances of activity that the day had brought to it. He walked to the window and stood looking out for a moment at the buildings across the street, where a few windows showed light and suggested that other clerks in other offices were engaged in similar rituals of closing. The building directly opposite housed a firm of solicitors, and through one of its illuminated windows Mr. Wickham could see the dim figure of a man moving about, presumably conducting his own end-of-day tasks. This figure appeared briefly, crossed from one side of the window to the other, and then disappeared, leaving the window as an empty rectangle of light that revealed nothing of the room beyond except its general dimensions. The street below was not entirely devoid of traffic, for the thoroughfare on which the building stood served as a route for those making their way from the commercial district toward the residential areas that lay to the north and west, and occasionally a cab or private carriage would pass, the sound of hooves on cobblestones rising faintly through the glass. A pedestrian hurrying against the cold would come briefly into view before passing beyond the window's frame, shoulders hunched and head down, moving with the purposeful haste of someone eager to reach shelter and warmth. The sky above the roof lines was that particular shade of deep blue that appears in the minutes after sunset, when the last reflected light of the departed sun still provides sufficient illumination to distinguish shapes and outlines, but when the details of things begin to dissolve into a uniform dimness that will shortly deepen into complete darkness. The transition from day to night was a gradual process, occurring not through any single dramatic change, but through the slow accumulation of small diminishments of light, each individually imperceptible, but together constituting a complete transformation of the visual environment. Mr. Wickham observed this gradual transformation without any particular thought about its significance, for it was a phenomenon he had witnessed many thousands of times before, and its regular recurrence had long since ceased to prompt any reflection beyond a simple acknowledgment that the day was ending according to its customary pattern. There was comfort in this regularity, in the absolute reliability of the sun to complete its daily arc and the darkness to follow in its appointed time, a comfort that extended to all the other regular patterns that structured his existence. The weekly rhythm of work days and the Sabbath, the monthly cycle of accounts to be tallied and balanced, the annual progression of seasons and holidays. He turned from the window and crossed the room to the tall cabinet that stood against the wall opposite the fireplace, a piece of furniture constructed from the same dark oak as the desk and fitted with doors that closed by means of brass latches that required a slight upward pressure to release them. The cabinet stood approximately 6 feet in height and 3 feet in width, its proportions suggesting that it had been built specifically for this room rather than being a standard piece of commercial furniture. Opening these doors revealed several shelves on which were stored various supplies necessary to the office's operation. The uppermost shelf held stacks of fresh paper of different sizes, the standard foolscap sheets used for correspondence arranged in one pile, the smaller sheets used for memoranda and internal notes in another, and several reams of the special heavy paper used for formal documents and contracts that required particular durability. These papers were of varying quality, from the rough and inexpensive variety used for draft work to the fine linen paper reserved for important correspondence, and Mr. Wickham maintained them in careful separation so that no inferior paper would be mistakenly used for a purpose that required something better. The second shelf contained bottles of ink in different colors, arranged according to type. In addition to the 3 inkwells on his desk, there were reserves of ink stored here against the possibility that the working supply might run low. Each bottle was sealed with a cork stopper and labeled to indicate its contents, and Mr. Wickham made a regular practice of checking these reserves to ensure that an adequate supply was always on hand. Below this were boxes containing steel pen nibs of various sizes, organized according to the width of line they produced. These nibs were manufactured by a firm in Birmingham that specialized in such items, and they arrived at the office in boxes of 1 gross, each nib individually wrapped in a twist of paper to prevent damage during shipping. Mr. Wickham would unwrap these nibs as they were needed, testing each one briefly on a scrap of paper to ensure that it was properly formed before fitting it to a pen holder. The lower shelves held several leather-bound volumes that served as reference works for questions of commercial practice or accounting procedure that might arise in the course of business. These included a dictionary of commercial terms, a guide to the various weights and measures used in trade, a compendium of exchange rates between British currency and the currencies of other nations, and a manual on the principles of double-entry bookkeeping that, though Mr. Wickham scarcely needed to consult it anymore, remained available for the occasional situation when some unusual transaction required verification of the proper method of recording. Mr. Wickham surveyed the contents of the cabinet with the automatic assessment that long familiarity had made habitual, noting that the supply of standard writing paper had diminished considerably and would require replenishment within the next week, and that one of the ink bottles appeared to be nearly empty and ought to be replaced soon. These observations he filed mentally for attention in the morning, when he would prepare a list of items to be ordered from the appropriate suppliers. The ordering of supplies was one of his regular responsibilities, and he maintained a system for tracking usage that allowed him to anticipate needs before they became urgent, thus avoiding the inefficiency of work being delayed for lack of materials. He closed the cabinet doors and secured the latches, then returned to his desk, where he opened the large central drawer and began the process of organizing its contents for the night. This drawer, which extended the full width of the desk and was perhaps 4 inches in depth, served as storage for various items that required frequent access, but which need not be left upon the desktop. Among these items was a sheet of blotting paper that showed the accumulated impressions of a full day's work. The surface covered with the reversed images of signatures and notations that had been pressed into it while the ink was still wet. This blotting paper he removed and examined briefly, noting the familiar patterns of his own handwriting as well as several signatures from correspondence that had crossed his desk during the day. The blotting paper was a kind of inadvertent record of the day's work, capturing in negative the various texts and figures that had been committed to more permanent forms elsewhere. Mr. Wickham folded this sheet once and placed it in a small bin beneath the desk that served as a receptacle for such items as could not properly be classified as waste, but which had nevertheless fulfilled their purpose and need not be retained. The bin would be emptied once a week by the building's porter, and its contents would be taken away to whatever fate awaited such materials, perhaps to be pulped and recycled into fresh paper, perhaps simply to be burned or buried. Mr. Wickham neither knew nor particularly cared, his responsibility ending with the proper sorting of materials and their placement in the appropriate receptacle. The drawer also contained certain personal items that Mr. Wickham kept at the office. There was a small volume of poetry, bound in green cloth and showing signs of frequent handling, that he would sometimes read during the brief interval he allowed himself at midday for taking refreshment. This volume contained works by various poets of the Romantic period, Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and Mr. Wickham found in these verses a kind of respite from the numerical precision of his work, a temporary excursion into a realm where feeling and imagination held precedence over calculation and exactitude. There is also a photograph mounted on cardboard showing a woman of perhaps 40 years whose features bore a certain resemblance to his own, this being his sister Catherine, who lived in Gloucester with her husband and 3 children. The photograph had been taken 2 years earlier during a visit Mr. Wickham had made to their household, and it showed Catherine standing in her garden with an expression of calm contentment that he recognized as characteristic of her temperament. They maintained a regular correspondence, Mr. Wickham and his sister, exchanging letters perhaps once a month in which they shared such news as their respective lives provided. These letters were not elaborate compositions, but rather straightforward accounts of daily circumstances the sort of ordinary communication that serves to maintain family connection across the distance that geography imposes. Mr. Wickham valued these letters and preserved them in a wooden box that he kept in his lodgings, occasionally rereading them on Sunday afternoons when he had completed his weekly tasks and found himself with time to spare. He looked at the photograph for a moment without removing it from the drawer, allowing his gaze to rest on his sister's familiar features, then closed the drawer gently and turned his attention to other matters. The clock on the mantelpiece indicated by its position that the hour was now approaching 7 o'clock, though Mr. Wickham did not consult it with any sense of urgency, for his evening held no particular obligations that would suffer from a few minutes' delay in his departure from the office. His lodgings were situated a comfortable walking distance away, perhaps 15 minutes at the pace he customarily maintained, in a street of residential buildings that lay between the commercial district and the more fashionable neighborhoods to the west. These lodgings consisted of a single room on the ground floor of a house owned by a widow named Mrs. Henshaw, who let out rooms to respectable single gentlemen and maintained her establishment according to standards that, while not luxurious, were adequate and reliable. Mrs. Henshaw provided a cold breakfast each morning and a cold supper each evening, except Sunday, when her lodgers were expected to take their midday meal out and make their own arrangements for the evening. The rent was reasonable, the room was clean, and the location was convenient, and these practical considerations outweighed any deficiencies in charm or comfort that a more particular person might have found objectionable. On Tuesday evenings, the supper consisted invariably of cold meat, bread, cheese, and tea, laid out in the small dining room that Mrs. Henshaw maintained for a lodger's use, though Mr. Wickham more often took his meal to his own room, preferring the privacy of his own space to the necessity of making conversation with the other residents. This supper could be taken at any hour before 9 o'clock without occasioning any inconvenience to Mrs. Henshaw, who would clear away whatever remained at that hour and retire to her own quarters. Mr. Wickham moved about the office now in a circuit that took him from the desk to the cabinet to the fireplace and back again, pausing at each station to ensure that all was as it should be, that no document had been left in a position where it might be disturbed by any draft that entered the room during the night, that the fire screen had been positioned correctly to prevent any stray sparks from reaching the floor, that the various implements of his work were properly stored and would be ready for immediate use when the office opened again in the morning. These inspections were conducted not from any particular anxiety about the possibility of disorder, but rather from a sense that the office deserved this attention, that the room in which he spent the greater part of his waking hours had earned through its faithful service a certain care in the manner of its closing. He did not think of this in such explicit terms, but the feeling was there nonetheless, manifesting in the deliberate nature of his movements and in the gentle precision with which he adjusted the angle of a chair or straightened a corner of the carpet that had become slightly turned up during the day's activities. The room itself seemed to settle more deeply into quietness as the minutes passed, the small sounds that punctuated the silence, serving only to emphasize the fundamental stillness rather than to disturb it. The coals in the fireplace shifted occasionally with a soft, settling noise as the burned portion collapsed, and the remaining fuel adjusted to fill the space. The gaslight emitted a barely perceptible hiss, the sound of gas flowing through the pipe and being consumed by the flame. The wooden paneling of the walls made small creaking sounds as the temperature dropped with the coming of night and the material contracted in response to the cooling air, these creaks occurring at irregular intervals and seeming almost to be the voice of the building itself, speaking in its own language of expansion and contraction, of the constant subtle movements that all structures undergo in response to changes in temperature and humidity. Mr. Wickham returned once more to his desk and stood before it, his hands resting lightly on its surface, looking down at the arrangement of objects he had just organized. Everything was in its place, every implement ready for the resumption of work on the following morning, when he would arrive at 8:30, hang his coat and hat on the hooks near the door, take his place at the desk, and begin again the sequence of tasks that constituted his employment. There was a certain satisfaction in this predictability, in knowing that tomorrow would unfold in much the same manner as today had unfolded, that the ledgers would be opened and entries would be made and correspondence would be reviewed and the various small transactions would be recorded in their proper columns. The work was not such as to inspire particular enthusiasm, nor did it present challenges that required unusual ingenuity or effort, but it was steady and it was sufficient, providing him with a livelihood and a structure to his days that many men in less fortunate circumstances would have envied. Mr. Wickham had learned, through the various vicissitudes of his earlier years, to value stability above excitement, regularity above novelty, and the quiet satisfaction of work performed competently above the more dramatic pleasures that others might seek in their employment. He understood that his position was modest, that his duties were routine, that his prospect for advancement were limited by the simple fact that the firm was small and there were only so many positions within it. But these realities did not trouble him as they might have troubled a younger man with greater ambitions. He had reached an age where he understood what was likely and what was not, where he had made his peace with the limitations of his circumstances and had learned to find contentment within them. This acceptance was not resignation, exactly, but rather a kind of mature acknowledgement that life presents each person with a particular set of possibilities, and that wisdom consists in part in recognizing which of those possibilities are genuinely available and which are merely the illusions created by youthful optimism or by the stories that society tells about advancement and success. The light from the window had now faded to the point where it contributed almost nothing to the illumination of the room, and the gaslight had assumed full responsibility for making visible the various objects and surfaces that occupied the space. Mr. Wickham moved to the window and drew the curtains closed, performing this action with the same measured care that characterized all his movements, ensuring that the heavy fabric hung evenly and that no gap remained through which the cold might enter or through which light from within might be visible from the street. The curtains were made of a thick woolen material of dark green color, lined with a lighter fabric to provide additional insulation against the cold. They hung from brass rings that slid along a brass rod mounted above the window frame, and they closed by means of a cord mechanism that allowed them to be drawn from either side. Mr. Wickham pulled this cord now, watching as the two panels of fabric moved together and met in the center, their edges overlapping slightly to create a seal against drafts. With the curtains drawn, the office took on a more enclosed quality, as though it had withdrawn from the world beyond its walls and existed now as a self-contained space independent of the city that surrounded it. The fire continued to glow, the gaslight continued to burn, and Mr. Wickham continued to move about the room, attending to the final small tasks that remained before the office could be properly closed for the night. He found himself standing once again before the fireplace, looking down at the coals that pulsed with their internal warmth, and he remained there for a longer moment than was strictly necessary, simply observing the play of light across the rough surfaces of the burning material. Occasionally, a brighter spot would appear as a pocket of gas escaped from within a coal and burned with a brief flare before subsiding back into the general glow. There is something almost hypnotic in watching these small variations, in seeing the way that the fire, though it appeared static from moment to moment, was actually in a state of constant change, the fuel being consumed and the patterns of light shifting in response to subtle movements of air and to the progressive collapse of the burning material as its structure weakened. Mr. Wickham watched these changes without trying to interpret them or to find any meaning in them beyond their simple physical reality, allowing his mind to rest in a state of unfocused observation that was perhaps as close as he came to what others might call meditation or contemplation. The warmth from the fire reached his face and hands, a gentle heat that did not overwhelm but simply provided a counterpoint to the cooler air that filled the rest of the room, and he stood there in a kind of suspension between activity and rest, neither moving forward to the next task, nor remaining entirely still, but occupying that intermediate state that sometimes descends in quiet moments when the mind has finished with its necessary work and has not yet found the next thing to engage its attention. Around him the office held its accumulated history, the countless hours of labor that had been performed within these walls, the thousands of entries that had been inscribed in ledgers, the innumerable letters that had been written and received and filed away, the steady accumulation of commercial activity that was the building's purpose and justification. Every surface in the room bore traces of this history, from the worn area of the carpet where feet had passed most frequently to the faint stains on the desktop, where ink had been spilled and imperfectly cleaned, from the scratches on the window glass where the frames had been opened and closed countless times, to the slight depression in the floorboards near the fireplace where generations of clerks had stood to warm themselves during the cold months. Mr. Wickham was part of this history now, his own contributions to the ledgers indistinguishable from those of the clerks who had preceded him and who would presumably follow after him, each man performing his small portion of the work and then departing to make way for the next. There was something both humbling and reassuring in this continuity, in the sense that the work itself was larger and more enduring than any individual who performed it, that the ledgers would continue to be filled and balanced whether Mr. Wickham was there to fill them or whether someone else had taken his place. He stirred at last from his reverie and moved to the small table that stood near the door, where he kept his outdoor coat and hat during the working day. The coat was of good quality wool, dark gray in color with black velvet on the collar and cuffs, and though it showed signs of wear at the elbows and along the bottom edge where it had dragged on pavements and rubbed against surfaces, it was still serviceable and presentable, still capable of providing the warmth and protection that a winter coat should provide. Mr. Wickham put on the coat now with movements that had become automatic through repetition, first one arm and then the other, settling the weight of the garment across his shoulders and adjusting it so that it hung properly. The coat had 5 buttons down the front, covered in the same fabric as the coat itself, and he fastened these now from bottom to top, his fingers working with practiced efficiency despite the inadequate light. The hat, a dark felt item of the sort that was standard for professional men of his class and occupation. He placed upon his head and adjusted to the proper angle by touch rather than by reference to any mirror, for there was no mirror in the office, and he had long ago learned to manage such matters through habit and propriety without requiring visual confirmation. The hat sat comfortably, neither too tight nor too loose, the brim angled slightly downward in the front to provide some protection against rain, and the crown shaped with a slight indentation that was both functional and fashionable according to the styles that had prevailed for the past several decades. Before extinguishing the gaslight, he made one final circuit of the room, confirming once more that all was in order, that the ledgers were properly stacked, that the pens were cleaned and stored, that the fire screen was in position, that the curtains were fully drawn, that nothing had been left undone that ought to have been attended to. This inspection revealed nothing requiring further attention for Mr. Wickham was thorough in his habits and rarely overlooked any detail of the closing routine, but the act of performing the inspection provided a sense of completion that merely knowing everything to be in order could not quite supply. He stood then at the threshold of the door, his hand upon the chain that would close the valve and extinguish the gas flame, and he paused there for a moment, looking back into the room that the light still illuminated, seeing it as it appeared at this hour, familiar and ordinary, a space that had been witness to countless ordinary hours of ordinary work. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would be remembered or commemorated. Simply the daily functioning of commercial life proceeding according to its established patterns. The room looked back at him with the patience of inanimate things, neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, simply existing in its proper form, ready to serve its function when required and content to rest in darkness when that function was not needed. The desk stood in its accustomed position, the chair placed neatly before it. The cabinet doors were closed, concealing the organized supplies within. The fireplace continued its gentle burning, indifferent to whether it was observed or not. The windows, hidden now behind their curtains, maintained their separation between interior and exterior, between the controlled environment of the office and the variable conditions of the street. There was something reassuring in this quality, in the absolute reliability of walls and desk and fireplace, to remain exactly as they were, to ask nothing and to offer only what they had always offered, which was a space in which work could be performed and hours could pass, and the slow accumulation of days could proceed toward whatever end awaited them. Mr. Wickham found comfort in this reliability, in the knowledge that when he opened the door tomorrow morning, everything would be as he left it, that the office would have waited patiently through the night for his return, neither changing nor requiring any attention beyond what he would provide in the normal course of his duties. He pulled gently on the chain, and the gas flame diminished and then disappeared, the cessation occurring not all at once, but in stages as the flow of gas decreased, and the flame grew smaller and smaller, until it finally extinguished with a tiny hiss that marked the transition from light to darkness. The room was now illuminated only by the faint glow of the coals in the fireplace, a glow that reached perhaps 3 feet into the darkness before failing entirely, so that most of the office was now invisible, present only as shapes suggested by familiarity rather than confirmed by sight. The desk was a dark rectangular mass. The windows, even behind their curtains, showed as slightly lighter rectangles on the wall. The cabinet was a tall shadow. The ceiling disappeared entirely into blackness. Mr. Wickham stood in the doorway for a moment longer, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness, making certain that the extinguishment of the gas had been complete and that no flame continued to burn that might pose a hazard during the night. Satisfied that all was well, he stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind him, turning the key in the lock and testing the handle to ensure that the mechanism had engaged properly. The lock was of solid construction, a brass cylinder fitted into the oak door, and it turned with a satisfying resistance that indicated proper functioning. Mr. Wickham removed the key and placed it in his coat pocket, where it would remain until he returned in the morning to unlock the door and begin another day. The corridor outside the office was dimly lit by a single gas lamp at its far end, positioned near the stairwell that provided access to the lower floors. This lamp burned at a reduced level during the evening hours, providing just enough illumination to allow safe navigation, but not so much as to waste gas during the hours when the building was largely unoccupied. The flame was perhaps half the size it would be during the working day, and the light it cast was correspondingly reduced, creating areas of deeper shadow between the lamp and the various doors that opened off the corridor. Mr. Wickham walked the length of the corridor with the same measured pace that characterized all his movements, neither hurrying nor lingering, simply progressing from one point to another in the manner that the circumstances required. His footsteps made small sounds on the wooden floor, sounds that echoed slightly in the confined space and then faded as he moved on. The corridor was perhaps 30 feet in length, and it took him perhaps 10 seconds to traverse it, and then he was at the head of the stairs, looking down into the dimness below. The stairs descended in 2 flights, separated by a landing, each flight consisting of perhaps a dozen steps with risers of conventional height and treads deep enough to provide secure footing. The steps were of oak, worn smooth in the center from decades of use, but still solid and safe. A banister of the same wood ran along the right side, mounted on iron supports that were fixed into the wall, and Mr. Wickham placed his hand upon this banister as he began his descent, using it not because he needed the support, but because it was the proper and safe thing to do when navigating stairs in dim light. He took the stairs at his customary rate, one hand on the banister, his footsteps making small sounds that echoed in the narrow stairwell and then faded as he continued downward. There was something ceremonial in this descent, in the passage from the 3rd floor where his work had been performed to the ground floor where he would exit the building and make his way to his lodgings, as though he were moving not just through space, but through different states of being, from the identity of clerk engaged in his duties to the identity of private individual making his way home at the end of the day. The landing between the 2 flights was illuminated by another small gas lamp, its light even dimmer than the one in the corridor above, and Mr. Wickham paused there briefly to allow his eyes to adjust before continuing down the 2nd flight. The pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for his vision to accommodate to the reduced light, but not long enough to constitute any significant delay in his progress. The 2nd flight of stairs brought him to the 1st floor, where another corridor extended, similar in dimensions to the one above, but occupied by different firms and serving different purposes. Mr. Wickham did not pause to observe these differences, for they were not relevant to his business, and he continued directly to the final flight that would take him to the ground floor and the building's exit. The ground floor contained the offices of Mr. Thornberry Sr., and also a small reception area where visitors were received during business hours, though at this time of evening all was dark and silent, the day's work having been concluded some time ago. The space was unfamiliar to Mr. Wickham in darkness, for he rarely had occasion to be in this part of the building except during the working day when natural light from the large front windows would fill the area. But he knew the layout well enough to cross it by memory and habit, requiring no light to guide him to the front entrance. The distance from the foot of the stairs to the front door was perhaps 20 feet, and Mr. Wickham covered this distance with careful steps, mindful of obstacles that might not be visible in the darkness, but which he could avoid through his knowledge of the space. There was a coat stand near the stairs, a small table against one wall, several chairs positioned for visitors to wait, and he navigated around these items without difficulty, arriving at the front door without incident. The door was equipped with 2 locks, one built into the handle mechanism and one separate bolt that slid into a socket in the door frame. Mr. Wickham drew back this bolt first, the metal making a slight grating sound as it moved, and then turned the key in the handle lock, feeling the mechanism disengage and the door become free to open. He pulled the door inward, felt the cold air of the evening meet him immediately, and stepped across the threshold onto the front step. The street outside was lit by gas lamps positioned at intervals of perhaps 50 feet, their light creating pools of illumination that left dark spaces between them. The air was cold, but not bitterly so, the temperature having dropped with the coming of darkness, but not yet reaching the point where frost would form. Mr. Wickham pulled the door, closed behind him, and tested it to ensure that it was properly secured, then descended the 3 steps that led from the building's entrance to the pavement. And there, on the street, with the building locked behind him and his lodgings waiting ahead, Mr. Wickham began the walk that would carry him from the world of commerce and employment to the world of private rest. A journey of 15 minutes through streets that held no particular interest or danger. Simply the ordinary passage of an ordinary man through an ordinary evening in the great city that surrounded him on all sides. Word count, approximately 10,000 words. I hope this longer, more detailed version provides the gentle, sleep-inducing narrative you were looking for. The story now explores the office and Mr. Wickham's evening routine with much greater depth and at a slower, more meditative pace. The pavement beneath his feet was uneven in the way that all London pavements were uneven, the individual stones having settled at slightly different levels over the decades since their installation, creating small ridges and depressions that a person learned to navigate through familiarity rather than through conscious attention. Mr. Wickham had walked this route so many times that his feet knew the irregularities without his mind needing to register them, and he moved forward with the automatic certainty of long habit, his pace steady and unhurried. The street lamps cast their pools of yellowish light at regular intervals, and Mr. Wickham passed through these pools in a rhythm that was almost musical, emerging from darkness into illumination and then back into darkness again, the transition occurring smoothly as he walked. The gas flames within their glass enclosures flickered slightly in response to air currents, but they burned steadily enough to provide adequate light for safe passage, and the combination of multiple lamps created a general visibility that, while not bright, was sufficient for the needs of those using the street at this hour. The buildings that lined either side of the street were mostly commercial structures similar to the one Mr. Wickham had just left, 4 or 5 stories in height, constructed of brick that had darkened with age and soot, their windows now mostly dark except for the occasional lighted rectangle that indicated someone still at work or perhaps a caretaker making his rounds. These buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with no gaps between them, forming continuous facades that channeled the street between them like a canyon of brick and mortar. Occasionally, a shop front would interrupt this commercial uniformity, a tobacconist or a stationer or a small establishment selling umbrellas and walking sticks. These shops having lowered their shutters for the night and secured their premises against theft or vandalism. The shutters were of wood, painted in various colors that were difficult to distinguish in the lamplight, and they were fitted with iron bars and heavy padlocks that spoke to the value of the goods contained within and to the necessity of protecting them during the hours when the shops were unattended. Mr. Wickham passed these shuttered establishments without particular attention, for they were familiar features of his daily route and held no interest beyond their simple existence as elements of the urban landscape through which he moved. A cat emerged from an alleyway and crossed the street ahead of him, moving with that peculiar combination of caution and confidence that cats display when navigating territory they know to be both theirs and not quite theirs. The animal paused briefly in the center of the street to look back at Mr. Wickham, its eyes catching the lamplight and reflecting it back in a greenish glow, then continued on its way and disappeared into the shadows on the opposite side. The sound of Mr. Wickham's footsteps was the dominant sound in the street at this moment, the measured tap of his boot heels on the pavement creating a rhythm that accompanied him as he walked. Occasionally other sounds would intrude, the distant rattle of a cab on some parallel street, the closing of a door somewhere nearby, the faint sound of voices from within one of the buildings he passed, but these sounds were muted and brief, serving mainly to emphasize the general quietness rather than to disturb it. As he walked, Mr. Wickham's mind occupied itself with the small practical considerations that naturally arise when a person is making his way home at the end of a working day. He thought briefly about the supper that would be waiting for him at his lodgings, the cold meat and bread and cheese that Mrs. Henshaw would have prepared. He thought about the letter he had received that morning from his sister Catherine, which he had read briefly during his midday interval, but which deserved a more thorough reading and perhaps a reply, though he had not yet decided whether to write that reply this evening or to wait until Sunday, when he would have more time to compose his thoughts properly. He thought about the tasks that awaited him tomorrow at the office, the continuation of the work he had left properly organized and ready for resumption. There was nothing particularly urgent or difficult in these tasks, simply the ongoing flow of transactions that needed to be recorded, correspondence that needed to be reviewed, accounts that needed to be maintained in their proper order. The predictability of this work was something that Mr. Wickham found reassuring rather than tedious, for it meant that each day could be approached with a clear understanding of what would be required and with confidence that those requirements were well within his capabilities to fulfill. The route from his office to his lodgings involved several turns, and Mr. Wickham made the first of these now, leaving the street on which the office building stood and entering a somewhat narrower thoroughfare that ran perpendicular to it. This street was more residential in character, though not exclusively so, with some of the buildings containing shops on their ground floors and living quarters above. The buildings here were slightly older and less uniform in their appearance, some of them dating from an earlier period of construction when architectural styles had been somewhat different and when the district had served a different function in the life of the city. The pavement here was slightly narrower, requiring Mr. Wickham to step aside briefly as another pedestrian approached from the opposite direction, this being a woman of perhaps 50 years who carried a basket covered with a cloth and who nodded politely as she passed. The exchange required no words, simply the mutual acknowledgement that two people were sharing the same limited space and that each would accommodate the other's presence with a minimum necessary adjustment to their respective paths. After passing the woman, Mr. Wickham continued along the street until he reached the next intersection, where he made another turn that brought him into a street that was quieter still, being almost entirely residential and containing no shops or commercial establishments except for a small dairy at its far end that would not open until early morning when the day's milk was delivered. The buildings here were somewhat narrower than those on the commercial streets, typically accommodating only one or two households per floor, and they had a slightly more domestic character in their facades, with window boxes that in warmer months would contain flowers, but which now stood empty, and with front doors that were painted in individual colors rather than the uniform dark browns and blacks that prevailed in the commercial district. The lamps on this street were spaced at greater intervals, perhaps 70 or 80 feet apart, creating longer stretches of darkness between the pools of light they cast. This reduced illumination did not trouble Mr. Wickham, for the street was familiar and safe, and the darkness was not so complete as to prevent him from seeing where he was going. The air here seemed slightly cleaner than in the commercial district, perhaps because fewer coal fires were burning, or perhaps simply because the residential buildings were better maintained and produced less smoke and soot. Mr. Wickham's lodgings were located approximately 2/3 of the way along this street, in a building that was indistinguishable from its neighbors except by its specific number, which was painted on the door frame in white numerals. As he approached this building, he withdrew from his pocket the key that would admit him to the front entrance, this being a separate key from the one that opened his office door, and he held it ready so that he would not need to fumble for it in the dim light of the doorway. The front door of Mrs. Henshaw's establishment was painted a dark green and fitted with a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head, this knocker being somewhat tarnished from age and weather, but still functional and respectable in appearance. Mr. Wickham did not use the knocker, for he had his key, and there was no need to disturb Mrs. Henshaw or any of the other lodgers by knocking. But he noted its presence with the same automatic awareness that registered all the familiar details of his daily route. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it, feeling the mechanism disengage, then pushed the door open and stepped into the narrow entrance hall that served as the common area for all the lodgers in the building. This hall was dimly lit by a single gas lamp mounted on the wall near the stairs, its flame kept low to conserve fuel during the evening hours, and it contained a small table on which Mrs. Henshaw placed correspondence for her lodgers and a stand with hooks for outdoor coats and umbrellas. The hall smelled faintly of the boiled cabbage that Mrs. Henshaw had prepared for her own midday meal, this odor having permeated the building and lingered despite the passage of several hours since the cabbage had been consumed. Mr. Wickham had long ago ceased to notice such smells except in a vague, peripheral way, for they were constants of his living situation, and he had become habituated to them through exposure. He closed the front door behind him quietly, not wishing to disturb the other lodgers, and secured the lock before proceeding to his own room, which was located on the ground floor at the rear of the building. The distance from the entrance hall to his door was perhaps 20 feet, and he covered this distance in near silence, his footsteps muffled by the runner of thin carpet that covered the center of the hallway floor. His room was accessed through a door of plain wood painted the same dark green as the front entrance, and this door he unlocked with yet another key, the third he had used in the course of his journey from office to lodgings. The lock turned smoothly, and he entered the room, closing the door behind him and standing for a moment in the darkness before locating the matches that he kept on a small shelf just inside the entrance. The room was cold, for no fire had been lit during his absence, but it was not unbearably so, and Mr. Wickham knew that it would warm slightly once he lit the lamp, and perhaps later the small spirit burner he kept for making tea if he desired it. He struck a match, the sulfur flaring briefly with its characteristic sharp smell, and applied the flame to the wick of the oil lamp that stood on the table near the window. The lamp was of simple construction, consisting of a glass reservoir for the oil, a brass mechanism that held the wick and could be adjusted to raise or lower it, and a glass chimney that protected the flame from drafts and directed the smoke upward. Mr. Wickham adjusted the wick until the flame burned steadily and at the appropriate height, neither too high, which would produce smoke, nor too low, which would provide insufficient light, then replaced the glass chimney and stood back as the light spread gradually through the room. The room was not large, perhaps 12 feet by 10, with a single window that looked out onto a small courtyard shared by several of the neighboring buildings. The window was fitted with curtains similar to those in his office, though of lighter material and less elaborate construction, and these curtains were closed, having been left in that position when he departed for work that morning. The walls were papered in a pattern of narrow vertical stripes in shades of brown and cream, and they bore no decoration except for a small framed print of a landscape scene that hung above the narrow bed. The furnishings were minimal but adequate to Mr. Wickham's needs. The bed, which was positioned along one wall, was of iron construction with a thin mattress and bedclothes that Mrs. Henshaw laundered once a fortnight. Beside the bed stood a small table that served as a nightstand, on which Mr. Wickham kept a few personal items, including a pocket watch that he wound each evening before retiring. Against the opposite wall stood a larger table that functioned as both a desk and a dining surface, with a single wooden chair positioned before it. A wardrobe of modest size occupied the corner near the door, and this contained Mr. Wickham's limited supply of clothing and personal effects. The most prominent feature of the room was the fireplace, smaller than the one in his office, but of similar construction, positioned on the wall opposite the window. The grate was cold and empty now, though Mr. Wickham kept a small supply of coal in a bucket beside the hearth, and he contemplated briefly whether to light a fire for the evening. The decision required balancing his desire for warmth against the cost of coal and the effort of tending a fire, and after a moment's consideration, he decided against it, reasoning that he would be retiring to bed soon enough, and that the bedclothes would provide sufficient warmth once he was lying down. On the table near the window, he found the plate that Mrs. Henshaw had prepared for his supper, covered with a cloth to keep off any dust or insects. He removed the cloth and examined the offerings, finding them to be exactly as expected: several slices of cold mutton, 3 pieces of bread with butter, a small wedge of cheese, and a pot of tea that had been left for him with instructions to heat water from the kettle that sat on a small spirit burner in the corner of the room. Mr. Wickham removed his coat and hat, hanging them on hooks inside the wardrobe door, then sat at the table to consume his supper. He ate without hurry, chewing each bite thoroughly and pausing between bites to sip the tea, which he had prepared by heating water in the kettle and pouring it over the tea leaves in the pot. The tea was strong and hot, and it provided a pleasant warmth that spread through him as he drank it, counteracting the chill of the room. As he ate, his mind wandered over the events of the day, reviewing them not with any particular purpose, but simply because this was the natural occupation of a mind at rest after a period of focused work. He thought about the accounts he had balanced, the correspondence he had reviewed, the small interactions with Mr. Thornberry Jr. that had punctuated the day's routine. Nothing in this review struck him as remarkable or worthy of particular reflection, and he found this absence of incident to be satisfying rather than disappointing, for it confirmed that the day had proceeded as it should have proceeded, according to the established patterns that governed his working life. When he had finished eating, he cleared away the plate and utensils, placing them on a tray near the door where Mrs. Henshaw would collect them in the morning. He then turned his attention to the letter from his sister Catherine, which he retrieved from his coat pocket and brought to the table where the lamplight would allow him to read it comfortably. The letter was written on 2 sheets of thin paper in his sister's familiar hand, which was neat and regular, though not as precise as Mr. Wickham's own professional script. She wrote of ordinary domestic matters, the progress of her children in their studies, a small difficulty with one of the servants that had been resolved satisfactorily, her husband's health, which continued to be generally good though he had suffered from a cold the previous week. She inquired after Mr. Wickham's own health and circumstances, expressed her hope that his work was progressing smoothly, and extended an invitation for him to visit again when the weather improved in spring. Mr. Wickham read the letter slowly, allowing the details to register fully in his mind, and when he had finished, he read it again, this second reading being more leisurely and attentive than the first. The letter created in his mind a sense of connection to his sister and her family, a temporary bridge across the distance that separated them. And he found comfort in this connection, even though it was mediated through paper and ink rather than through actual presence. He considered whether to write a reply this evening, but decided after a moment's thought that he would wait until Sunday, when he would have more time and mental energy to devote to the task. For now, it was sufficient to have read the letter and to know that his sister and her family were well. He folded the sheets carefully and placed them in a small wooden box on the shelf above his bed, where he kept all the correspondence he had received from Catherine over the years. The lamp continued to burn steadily on the table, its light creating a small circle of illumination that pushed back the darkness but did not entirely dispel it, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Mr. Wickham sat at the table for a few minutes longer, not engaged in any particular activity, but simply resting, allowing his mind to settle into the quietness that would prepare him for sleep. The building around him was mostly silent, though occasionally he could hear faint sounds from the other lodgers in their rooms. A footstep on the floor above, the closing of a door somewhere along the hallway, the distant sound of someone coughing. These sounds did not disturb him, but rather reassured him of the presence of other human beings sharing the same space, each engaged in their own private routines at the end of the day. Eventually, he rose from the table and began the process of preparing for bed. This involved removing his work clothes and folding them carefully to be worn again the next day, as was his practice since he owned only 2 complete sets of working attire and could not afford to have them both out of service at the same time. He hung his trousers on a peg inside the wardrobe and placed his waistcoat and shirt on the chair, arranging them so that wrinkles would not set in overnight. His nightshirt, which hung on another peg in the wardrobe, he put on now, the cotton fabric cold against his skin at first, but quickly warming from contact with his body. The nightshirt was plain white, much washed and therefore quite soft, reaching to just below his knees and loose enough to allow comfortable movement during sleep. Before extinguishing the lamp, Mr. Wickham performed a few final tasks. He wound his pocket watch, a duty he attended to each evening with a regularity of ritual, turning the small key exactly 15 times, which experience had taught him was sufficient to keep the watch running accurately through the following day. He placed the watch on the small table beside the bed where he would be able to hear its ticking during the night, a small sound that he found comforting rather than intrusive. He retrieved from the shelf the volume of poetry that he sometimes read before sleeping. But tonight he felt no inclination to read, the quietness of his mind being already sufficient to ease him toward rest without the need for words to occupy his attention. He returned the book to its place and stood for a moment beside the bed, looking around the small room that contained all his worldly possessions and constituted the private portion of his existence. The room looked back at him with the same patient neutrality that his office had shown, neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, simply existing as the space in which he conducted the personal aspects of his life. The narrow bed with its thin mattress and carefully tucked bedclothes, the table with its single chair, the wardrobe with its modest contents, the cold fireplace, the curtained window. These things were sufficient for his needs, and he had long ago ceased to wish for anything more elaborate or comfortable, having learned that contentment came not from the accumulation of possessions, but from the acceptance of what one had and the proper maintenance of those simple things that made life practicable. He extinguished the lamp, turning the small key that closed the valve and cut off the flow of oil to the wick. The flame diminished gradually and then disappeared, leaving the room in complete darkness except for the faint line of light that showed beneath his door from the gas lamp in the hallway. This thin line of light was barely sufficient to outline the shapes of objects in the room, but Mr. Wickham had no need of greater illumination, for he knew every inch of the space through long familiarity and could navigate to the bed without difficulty. He pulled back the bedclothes and climbed into the bed, feeling the mattress yield slightly under his weight. The sheets were cold, as they always were at first, but he knew they would warm quickly from his body heat. He pulled the blankets up to his chin and arranged himself in his accustomed sleeping position, lying on his right side with his knees slightly bent and his hands folded together beneath his cheek. The building settled around him into its nighttime quietness, the sounds of other lodgers gradually diminishing as they too prepared for sleep. The watch on the bedside table ticked steadily, marking out the seconds with mechanical precision. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The wind, which had been calm earlier, began to move with slightly greater force and mystery. Wickham could hear it passing over the rooftops and between the buildings, a sound that was neither threatening nor particularly soothing, but simply part of the acoustic landscape of the city at night. His mind, having completed its review of the day's events and attended to all the small practical matters that required attention, began now to release its hold on conscious thought. Images and impressions drifted through his awareness without any logical connection, fragments of memory and sensation that arose and dissolved without his directing them. The columns of figures in the ledger, the glow of coals in the fireplace, the cold air of the street, the taste of a tea he had drunk with his supper, his sister's handwriting on the letter, the sound of his own footsteps on the stairs. These images grew increasingly vague and disconnected as sleep approached, the boundary between waking and sleeping becoming less distinct with each breath. The tension that had accumulated in his muscles during the day began to release, his shoulders dropping slightly, his jaw unclenching, his hands relaxing their fold beneath his cheek. The rhythm of his breathing slowed and deepened, becoming more regular as conscious control gave way to the automatic processes that govern the body during sleep. The darkness of a room seemed to grow more complete, or perhaps it was simply that his eyes had closed, or perhaps there was no longer any meaningful distinction between the darkness outside and the darkness within, both having merged into a single undifferentiated space where consciousness could rest without the burden of perception or thought. And in that space, in that gentle dissolution of awareness, Thomas Wickham found what he had been seeking without knowing he sought it, the simple release of sleep, the daily death and resurrection that allows human beings to continue day after day through all the ordinary moments that constitute a life. The watch continued its ticking. The lamp in the hallway continued its burning. The city continued its vast, complicated existence beyond the walls of the small room. But for Mr. Wickham, all of this had receded into insignificance, and there was only the quiet darkness and the soft rhythm of breathing and the slow descent into dreams that would carry him through to morning, when the cycle would begin again. Thank you for listening to this Victorian story. If you enjoyed it, you might consider leaving a quiet comment below and perhaps subscribing for more calming stories to accompany your relaxation. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.